Hi, I'm Dwayne Brown. Tonight on KPBS Evening Edition, a military training mission ends in San Diego Bay, the maneuver the pilot was working on before losing control of the aircraft.
The mornings are always the same. In disarray.
Facing down his disease, a newspaper man writes about life after being diagnosed with Alzheimer's. Peggy Pico has more on his personal journey.
There's a lot of humor in them, and I like at the moment they almost feel on the verge of collapse.
On display now in Barrio Logan, sculptures crafted from cardboard and duct tape. The challenge from the artists behind these colorful works. KPBS Evening Edition starts right now. Hi, good evening. Thanks for joining us. Up for sale in San Diego, President Obama's poster child for solar manufacturing. No word yet on the sale price for Soitec Solar. The company landed a $25 million federal grant to open its plant in Rancho Bernardo, but ran into trouble when the cost of solar panels dropped. Soitec lost key contracts, including one with SDG&E. It's not clear if the company will remain here in San Diego. Today, state water officials accepted a historic offer from California farmers. They agreed to cut their water use by 25%. This after state officials warned the deep cuts were on the way. It's a concession forced by the state's ongoing drought. Farmers in the Central Valley hold some of the state's oldest water rights. Under the deal, Delta farmers have until June 1st to lay out how they will reduce their water use. Feeling the squeeze from the drought, county water managers may boost the cost of water here next year. The Water Authority is working to remain solvent as mandatory water cutbacks trim the agency's revenues, and the Carlsbad desalination plant pushes up expenses. Water Authority is thinking about a 6% increase for untreated water and a 5.5% increase for treated water. Water managers say it would be smaller than the double-digit increases we faced during the last drought. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has resurrected San Diego's lawsuit against an oil company over the cleanup of a gas plume under Qualcomm Stadium. KPBS investigative reporter Amitha Sharma says the plume dates back to a series of spills in the 1980s from a petroleum tank farm now owned by Kinder Morgan. Amitha Sharma joins us now. Amitha, what does the court's decision mean for this case?
Well, Dwayne, the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals ruling this week means the city's lawsuit seeking damages from Kinder Morgan can go to trial. San Diego City Attorney Jan Goldsmith says the city has missed out on pumping 3 million gallons of drinking water a day from an aquifer at the stadium for decades because of the contamination. He went on to say the city still hopes to be able to pump that water once the water and the property are cleaned up, but he says the city's experts don't believe that's happened yet.
And Amitha, what does Kinder Morgan say about the appeals court decision?
Kinder Morgan spokesman Richard Wheatley said the company is still reviewing the decision. He said the city has suffered no harm from what he called the former contamination, other than the legal fees from its own lawsuit. Kinder Morgan also maintains that the soil and groundwater, quote, remediation were successfully completed to meet deadlines set by state water regulators.
KPBS investigative reporter Amitha Sharma. A military plane landed in the bay near Shelter Island this afternoon. It took off from the Naval Air Station North Island. The Navy says the pilot of the T-45 Goshawk ejected before the aircraft hit the water. A civilian boat actually rescued him. The Navy says the pilot was on a routine training mission and was practicing an aircraft carrier landing. So far, no word on injuries. A rare strain of salmonella left 7 people sick in San Diego County. State health officials say the patients may have ate raw tuna typically found in sushi. The latest salmonella outbreak covers 53 cases in 9 states. No deaths have been reported. 10 people were hospitalized. Health officials say many patients reported eating spicy tuna sushi. Common hygiene practices may help prevent salmonella, like washing your hands thoroughly before and after eating and cooking foods to an internal temperature of about 165 degrees Fahrenheit. That can kill salmonella as well. He's been shaking things up in the name of social change for decades, from 15 years as a journalist and community organizer to formerly the CEO of the nation's oldest civil rights group, the NAACP. Now, Ben Jealous is bringing his message of social equality to San Diego. We are a nation of immigrants, and this museum is celebrating our cultural diversity. That's something that you take very personal, don't you?
Well, look, we may have come over here in different boats, but we're all on the same boat now. Whether it's a slave ship or whether you came through Ellis Island, not only are we in the same boat now, we're often in the same family now.
Ben Jealous is a perfect fit for the Rabble Rouser series put on by San Diego grant makers. He says philanthropic support for various social problems can lift all people and provide communities equal access to opportunities for success.
Our country is rapidly becoming a nation only of minorities, and that means that all of us have to be bring a sense of urgency to the work that we do around inclusion, the work that we do around diversity, the work that we do just to make this country more fair for all of us.
He says it's important we trust and acknowledge what we're seeing happen during police stops involving young men of color.
If we're honest about our history, whether it's the Irish, whether it's the Chinese, whether it's the Japanese, whether it's Chicanos, whether it's black folks, there's been at least one moment in history, typically a long one, where our relationship with the cops was not what we wanted it to be.
Jealous says the biggest danger is to ignore what's happening between police and communities.
There's been an evolving, if you will, of the police force in this country, and sort of a narrowing of the groups that we let them bully. And the last groups are really blacks and Latinos. We've got to fix that and finally get to a place where the people who have sworn to respect and protect all of us do just that.
By the way, Jealous's family has roots in San Diego. His father opened the Head Start program here back in the 60s. Signs of recovery on California's jobs front. New numbers show the state's unemployment rate actually dipped slightly last month to 6.3%. That still exceeds the nation's unemployment rate of 5.4%. Here in San Diego, the unemployment rate was less than 5% last month. Several industries saw new job openings, from finance to hospitality, but the construction sector lost the most jobs in San Diego. Saving a sea lion from the Santa Barbara oil spill, he is recovering now at SeaWorld. Crews actually took the lion to the park's Oiled Wildlife Care Center. That was last night. Vets say he was extremely lethargic and emaciated. They worked on cleaning up the oil coating his body, face, and flippers. Animal care specialists say they were cautiously optimistic about her chances for survival. 100 workers are standing by at SeaWorld to help with the recovery efforts in Santa Barbara. Crews say weather has actually slowed down cleanup efforts off the Santa Barbara coast. Gusty winds whipping up waves as high as 4 feet today. Workers are trying to excavate the section of pipe that broke Tuesday, spilling an estimated 105,000 gallons of crude oil. We are one step closer to a state ban on key ingredient in beauty products. Today, Assembly members approved one of the nation's toughest bans on plastic exfoliating microbeads. They're used in many products, from toothpaste to face soaps. Environmentalists are targeting microbeads because they don't break down and they remain in the water supply where fish can eat them.
Those exfoliants could be made with natural materials, coconut shell, apricot shell, but it's cheaper to put plastic in them, so they're putting these hard little bits of plastics into these products that we put on our body and that we put in our body, and it's impacting our health and it's impacting the environment.
The bill would prohibit the sales of personal care products containing microbeads starting in 2020. It now moves on to the state Senate. Earlier this week, we brought you an interview with a supporter of what's known as physician-assisted suicide. Tonight, Peggy Pico continues the conversation with a San Diego man who's on the opposite side of the issue.
Joining me is Ken Barnes with the California Against Assisted Suicide Coalition. And Ken, welcome to Evening Edition.
Thank
now,
you.
Earlier this week, the California Medical Association became the first medical group in the nation to drop their opposition to assisted death legislation, making its way through the state of California. So what is your reaction to their change, going from not opposing it anymore to neutral?
Well, they're not supporting it. They're simply backed off a little bit based upon the reaction of some of their physicians. But most importantly, the physicians who are most closest to this are the oncologists. They see death all the time. And the Oncologists Association, both Northern California and Southern California, came out immediately and kind of reiterating their steadfast opposition to physician-assisted suicide. So there's still, the medical community hasn't rallied around this. You just have one particular organization that is no longer actively fighting it.
Right. The California Medical Association actually says the end-of-life decision should be made between a patient and the physician. Shouldn't that be an individual decision?
If it was in a vacuum, yes, but it's not. What happens is when you introduce something like this into the system, you expose people to just an incredible number of dangers. So, for example, it's modeled after Oregon. Oregon is a very homogeneous state. Everyone looks the same. The income levels are fairly flat, and even across the board. Here in California, that's not the case. You have a number of persons, they're undocumented, they're low income, they don't have high education, they don't have persons in that room able to advocate for them to make the proper decisions at end of life. And if you introduce this low-cost option, you really endanger the lives of high-cost patients. Because if you're disabled, if you maybe don't have a lot of money, the hospital or insurer is picking up a lot of the tab.
Supporters in Aid and Dying bill in Sacramento right now say there are safeguards for that they provide oversight and would mirror Oregon's right to die laws, which have been in place since 1994 with these safeguards. So what is your response to that these laws could have safeguards to protect the very people you were talking about?
That even with the so-called safeguards, that they've never really been able to kind of explain what they are. There's been a number of questionable cases. You've had persons who have been denied a long list of medical treatments that they would want, and maybe not at the same time say, hey, but you can, kill yourself. They'll then receive authorization for medication to terminate their lives. And those are the things that we're concerned about. It's not, we don't believe that someone will overtly say, hey, we want you to terminate your life. That's not the issue. It's the implied pressure, the implied consent, the person who's there to say, I don't want to be a burden to my family, which is the number one reason that persons in Oregon choose to end their lives early, is they feel that they're going to be a burden to their family.
Yeah, you actually, I understand, had personal experience with end-of-life choices. What happened and how did that outcome shape your opinion on this?
Interesting. I've had a couple of experiences with it. One close, I have a twin brother who's no longer living. And in his case, he had cerebral palsy from birth. So I'd spent our entire life growing up, he in a wheelchair. And again, there was always a consistent moment with physicians like, hey, we don't know how much longer he has to live. And that's not uncommon in the disabled community with persons with a lot of severe issues. He's blind, he's quadriplegic, he's unable to speak. With that in mind, there is that concern that, well, what happens to other disabled persons? They're very high cost to take care of. It is what it is. And they often face terminal diagnoses, and then they don't die. And so when you introduce something like this, what safeguards are there to protect those persons from being kind of cast aside because they're expensive and because possibly they become a burden?
Would you say, in going with that, you're talking about somebody who's disabled. What about the patient who really does have a terminal illness, who's in pain, let's say terminal cancer, brain cancer, an adult who's been given not long to live? What do you say to that patient?
I say to them that we have a number of options, and what we really should be focused on is on palliative and hospice care. There's really not a lot of attention given to that, or resources. Frankly, I am familiar with persons who are very close to me who have lost someone that had a tough time in the last week or 2 weeks of their life. What there's not a lot of room for is once you take that person out of the ICU, there's not a lot of places to go. And if we address that side, address the care, and not address, well, let's just give the person the ability to commit suicide, that's just kind of a corrosive approach to society.
All right, we are out of time. Ken Barnes, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
The tedious debate and flying lawsuits over one paseo may be over at last, but the arguments over a new stadium for the Chargers continue. What happens if the team leaves or if they stay? Join us for the KPBS Roundtable tonight at 8:30.
The Marines are bringing back a tradition honoring those who have made the ultimate sacrifice. It's a tradition that has been on hiatus for more than 40 years.
May this garden be a reminder that the strength of our nation begins with the strength of our families.
This is the Gold Star Garden at the Marine Corps Recruit Depot. The garden honoring the families of service members lost in combat began growing in 1921, but in the early 70s, organizers put the planning on hold.
For a service that is as proud of its history as ours, I wish I could tell you why it lapsed in the 70s. Something having to do with the Vietnam era, I presume.
2 trees planted are for service members and veterans, plus 1 for those who were killed in the line of duty. Helping loved ones understand his journey, NPR has featured a lifelong journalist living with early onset Alzheimer's in special series on the disease. The Cape Cod reporter also opened his life and home to filmmakers, documenting his work. Peggy Pico talks with him about what it's like to write about the disease while living with it.
From keeping detailed journals to public speaking, an NPR series, and writing the book On Pluto, Inside the Mind of Alzheimer's, my guest Greg OBrien reveals an intimate look at living with the disease and how it affects his mind, body, family, and identity. Author Greg OBrien, welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Now, since your diagnosis of early onset Alzheimer's 5 years ago, you've been documenting this process. Why did you want to share it this way?
Well, first of all, for background, my maternal grandfather and my mother died of Alzheimer's. About a month and a half ago, my paternal uncle died. Before my father died, he was diagnosed with dementia. In addition to the symptoms and the diagnosis and the brain scans, I also carry the Alzheimer's marker gene, APOE4. So the doctors tell me I'm not getting out of it. And Alzheimer's is a disease that can take 20 years to run its course. The stereotype is that you're 80 years old and you're dying in a nursing home, which we'll all be someday. But that's not the full story of Alzheimer's. And I promised my mother before she died I'd tell the full story.
And in your book on Pluto, you talk about fighting through Alzheimer's fog of dementia. What do you do to fight that?
Well, it's 24/7 focus. I find if I'm not moving forward, I'm moving backwards. I tell people I'm not stupid, I just have a disease, but my brain is like an iPhone. It's still a sophisticated device, but it breaks down, it pocket dials, it gets lost very easily, and it has a short-term battery. And Alzheimer's is like a light that flicks on and off, and in the early stages, and it goes off, and you go into tremendous rage because the brain is not firing properly, and you get mad because you know it shouldn't be that way. And it's difficult.
You also write, though, about the urge to just drift into dementia, and you describe it in a way that makes it seem like it's not that bad. What do you mean by just kind of drifting into dementia?
Well, I call it Pluto because when I was an investigative reporter in the early days at the Arizona Republic when I was 28, reporting on the mafia, I would tell my sources we're going to go off the record to a place where no one can hear what is said. And I was fascinated with Pluto. And later in life, in fighting Alzheimer's and dementia, as I said before, it's a 27 fight, and there are times you get so fatigued that you have to let go, but letting go is peaceful, and I had to invent a place that I felt comfortable going to. And my mom and my grandfather and uncle have been out to Pluto, and there'll be a time when I won't return myself.
Now, you said that you're also in a race with a demon called Alzheimer's, and you see it gaining on you. How is this gaining on you? How do you see it affecting you in your body?
It affects in many ways. 60% of my short-term memory now is gone in 30 seconds. I don't recognize people I've known all my life, including my wife on 2 occasions. I don't recognize familiar places. I see things that aren't there. It's called hallucinations, and they're scary. And I fly into tremendous rage. The left side of my brain is in a free fall. The right side, which is a creative sweet spot, praise God, is still somewhat intact.
Now, you're very objective about this, and you've said that you think you have 3 to 4 years, good years left. What would you like to do in those 3 to 4 years?
Well, in those 3 to 4 years, I have a strong faith, Irish Catholic. I'm a bit more evangelical, but don't tell my relatives in Dublin because they're going to stone me. But I feel that, again, this is the most important story of my life I've ever written. And I want to see this story through, and I want to write for as long as I can. And I don't want anyone's pity, as the old saying, and with your viewers, anyone who doesn't think they're going to die someday, would you please raise your right hand? So, as Bugs Bunny said, no one gets out alive. So I want to take this time and do the best I can.
Now, you come from a family of 10.
Right.
You have a history in your family of Alzheimer's. What's the most important thing you want to say to a person, either just diagnosed with Alzheimer's or family members, about the disease?
What I want to say is that you can live with Alzheimer's. It's a 20-year cycle. You can live in faith, humor, and hope. And sure, the demons are going to chase you. But as I said in my book, lying down in football and wrestling is a position of defeat. To people who are dealing with people with Alzheimer's, I want to say, try to understand them. We're not stupid. We just have a disease. And to the caregivers of the world, they're the heroes. These are the people who aren't going to forget. I'll forget someday. But my family, excuse me, it's always tough to talk about, but my family won't forget.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I'm sure it is tough to talk about. Author and journalist Greg OBrien, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Gwen Ifill on the next news hour, turning a Washington, D.C. row house into a home for transgender youth with nowhere else to go. That's Friday on the PBS NewsHour.
Taking a look inside a hidden artistic trove on Logan Avenue. It specializes in experimental and contemporary art. KPBS reporter Beth Accomando says the gallery challenges how we define what art is.
What is art? You've been taught that this is art, and so is this, and this. But maybe you've had your doubts about this or this. Or perhaps you've looked at a piece of art and just didn't know what to think.
And it's okay not to understand it right away. I think it's okay. I think being uncomfortable is okay. I think anything that evokes some kind of emotion, it's almost worse if you went in and you almost felt nothing. But the only way to really get at what you may or may not like is to go and look at it in the first place.
Essentially to experiment, which is exactly what Punto Experimental is all about. It's located at 2151 Logan Avenue, but you have to wind your way around the block to find the alley entrance to this recent addition to the Barrio Logan Art District. The name means experimental point, which sums up what Hugo Heredia Barrera wants the gallery to be.
I love experimental work, and also for me the gallery is an experiment because I never ever had a gallery and I never run a gallery. Everything that happens here, it's some sort of an experiment. You never know how it's going to be. You never know how it's going to work.
Heredia Barrera is an artist who works with glass and metal. He felt San Diego didn't showcase enough experimental, abstract, and contemporary work, art that he says people might not initially define as pretty.
But it challenged people to think what it is, why the artists are using those materials, why are they using those shapes, and that's kind of like why I'm doing it.
Botello welcomes the idea of having people debate what art is.
A lot of my students will be like, wow, this is really interesting. I never really thought that art could be this. And I love this idea of sort of breaking down what we typically think of as art.
Botello challenges expectations by employing everyday items such as cardboard, paper, and duct tape to create her sculptures. The first thing you notice about her work is the bold use of color and abstract forms.
To look at life's sort of absurdities and the beauty, but also the fragilities of life, and then create those kinds of ideas in an object. And to tell that story either in a literal sense, in a narrative, or in a more abstract way.
If you don't immediately see a narrative in these abstract shapes, then let the artist provide some insight.
The title of it's called Let It Fall because you can see how one shoe has fallen and the dog has it in his mouth. And I think it's this idea of like how much we're willing to give to the world, to nature, and the sense of vulnerability. And it really is about interconnectedness and how everything in life is interconnected. So I wanted to sort of just go from these larger themes, and very labor intensive to make for sure, but I wanted a sense of humor in the work too, so that I can address these more serious themes.
But sometimes the form itself is the narrative, as in Shine On.
I I love this idea of movement. So for me, it was a more formal approach, but I wanted this idea of something moving away from a larger structure, either being pulled down, this weight about it, like you don't know anymore if it's actually going to fall off the piece. So really, again, about connection in some way.
Botello hopes her work inspires, even forces the viewer to walk around and look inside her sculptures and explore them from different angles.
And in some places, there's these strong areas of action, and then letting it sort of quiet down. But I wanted that. I wanted the viewer to feel that they can sort of explore and discover something new if they were willing to give it the time to do it.
People will like some things and people won't like other things, but the point is to bring art that is experimental.
Both artists hope people will accept the challenge presented by experimental art.
And I think anytime you're looking at art you have to be open-minded. So that's what I recommend, is being open to it, because it is difficult if it's new to you. But new things is what helps us grow.
Plus, Botello's work suggests that every one of us has the means to create art if we just look at the things around us with new eyes. Beth Accomando, KPBS News.
You can find tonight's stories on our website, kpbs.org/evening edition. Thank you for joining us tonight. Have a great weekend.